She's leaving with me tonight, not you. Deal with it. The arrogant stranger in my kitchen thought he won my wife. I just nodded and smiled. What he didn't know was that my late uncle left me more than just a building. He left me the keys to destroy anyone who crossed me. By morning, this cocky homewrecker would discover that some men don't get mad. They get even in ways that will haunt you forever. My name is Alexander Brooks. I'm 42 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. 3 successful fast food franchises across town, a beautiful wife of 18 years, and my daughter Ashley starting her sophomore year at State. I'd built everything from scratch after getting out of the Army, working 16-hour days to give my family the life they deserved. That Thursday started like any other. I was reviewing quarterly reports at my kitchen table when Sandra walked in with someone I'd never seen before. Tall guy, probably around 40, wearing an expensive suit that screamed, "I've got money." He had that cocky smile guys where when they think they're about to win something big. "Alex," Sandra said, her voice unnaturally steady. "This is Blake Stevens." Blake stepped forward without offering his hand. Instead, he leaned against my kitchen doorframe like he owned the place, one ankle crossed over the other. The arrogance in his posture made my jaw tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "She's leaving with me tonight, not you," Blake announced, his voice carrying that deliberate emphasis people use when they want to drive a knife deeper. "Deal with it." I just nodded. Sandra stood behind him, pretending to check her phone, but I caught her stealing glances at my face. They were both waiting for the explosion, the shouting match, maybe even hoping I'd take a swing at him. That's what weak men do when they're cornered. They let emotion override strategy. I set down my coffee mug carefully and met Blake's eyes. "Noted," I said simply. The silence stretched between us like a loaded spring. Blake's confident smirk faltered for just a second before he forced out a laugh. Sandra joined in, but her laugh sounded brittle, forced. They thought my calm meant defeat. They had no idea they'd just declared war on the wrong man. After they left, I sat in my kitchen for exactly 10 minutes, letting the reality sink in. Then I walked to my home office and opened the safe behind my Army commendation photos. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the keys to my late uncle's building downtown, the place nobody knew I owned. Uncle Frank had left me more than just property when he passed 5 years ago. He'd left me an education in how the world really works. Time to put that education to use. Uncle Frank's building stood in the old warehouse district, squeezed between a tire shop and a place that sold restaurant equipment. No signs, no business hours posted, nothing to indicate what went on inside. That's exactly how Frank had wanted it. The key turned smoothly in the lock, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old paper. I flicked on the lights, and the fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life, casting harsh shadows across rows of filing cabinets that lined the walls. Frank had been what people politely called a problem solver back in the day. Companies came to him when they needed things handled quietly. Permits expedited, zoning issues resolved, competitors convinced to look elsewhere. He never broke the law, but he sure knew how to bend it until it almost snapped. When he died, he left me everything. The building, the files, and most importantly, the contacts. Knowledge is power, Alex, he used to tell me. But knowing when to use it, that's wisdom. I pulled open the first filing cabinet. Inside were manila folders organized by year, each one thick with documents, photographs, and handwritten notes in Frank's careful script. The names on the tabs read like a who's who of local business and politics. The second cabinet held more recent files. I ran my finger along the tabs until I found what I was looking for: Stevens Development Group, Blake's company. Inside the folder were building permits, zoning applications, and several photographs of Blake shaking hands with city councilmen at various social events. But it was the last document that made me smile. A complaint filed by the Better Business Bureau, alleging that Stevens Development had used substandard materials in a low-income housing project. The complaint had been mysteriously withdrawn 2 weeks later. I photographed every page with my phone, then moved to the third cabinet. This one was different. Instead of business files, it contained personal information. Background checks, financial records, family histories. Frank had always said you never knew when someone's past might become relevant to their present. I found Blake's personal file wedged between 2 others. Inside were bank statements from 3 years ago, showing some interesting cash deposits that didn't match his reported income. There were also photos of him at a casino in Atlantic City, taken during a weekend when he was supposed to be at a business conference in Chicago. But the real treasure was at the bottom of the file. A police report from 15 years ago, when Blake was still married to his first wife. Domestic disturbance call. No charges filed, but the officer's notes were detailed. Blake had a temper, and alcohol made it worse. I spent the next 2 hours photographing everything, creating digital copies of Frank's analog wisdom. By the time I locked up and headed home, I had enough material to keep Blake busy for the rest of his natural life. Sandra thought she was trading up. She had no idea she was about to hitch her wagon to a man with more skeletons than a haunted house. The drive home gave me time to think about my next move. Frank always said the key to winning any fight was to control the battlefield. Blake had chosen to fight me on my home turf. Now it was time to show him what a mistake that was. I was at Harold Richardson's law office by 8:30 the next morning. Harold had been my attorney since I bought my first franchise, and more importantly, he'd been Uncle Frank's lawyer for 20 years before that. He understood how the game was really played. "Alex," Harold said, gesturing to the chair across from his mahogany desk. "You sounded urgent on the phone." I slid a thick envelope across the desk. "I need asset protection. Everything moved into irrevocable trusts, effective immediately." Harold opened the envelope and began reading the documents I'd prepared. His eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't ask questions. That's why I paid him what I did. "The restaurants, the house, investment accounts," he said, scanning the pages. "You want to move everything. Everything except one checking account with $5,000. That stays joint. This is comprehensive, Alex. Are you sure?" "Dead sure." Harold's fingers drummed once on his desk. "I can have the paperwork ready by this afternoon. But once these trusts are established, unwinding them would be extremely difficult." That's the point. While Harold worked on the legal documents, I drove to my flagship restaurant. The lunch rush was in full swing, and I watched my manager Carlos handle the controlled chaos with military precision. Good people, all of them. They deserved to know their jobs were secure, no matter what happened with Sandra. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Dad, Mom says she's staying at Aunt Kelly's for a while." "What's going on?" I typed back. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Focus on your studies." But it was something to worry about. Ashley was 19, old enough to understand that her mother's visit to her sister's house wasn't temporary. She was also smart enough to help me if I needed it. Ashley had grown up digital, understanding social media and technology in ways that could be useful. Another text came in, this time from Sandra. "We need to talk about finances." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Let her sweat. By tonight, there wouldn't be any finances to discuss. Harold called at 4 p.m. "Everything's done. The trusts are established. Assets transferred. Legally speaking, you own nothing and everything simultaneously." "Perfect. Send copies to my accountant." "Alex," Harold's voice carried a warning. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it's legal." "Don't worry, Harold. I learned from the best." That evening, I sat in Uncle Frank's building, looking through more files. I'd found something interesting about Blake's business partner, a man named Tommy Sullivan. Turned out Tommy had some gambling debts that Blake had been helping him cover. Debts to people who didn't accept payment plans. I photographed those documents too. Insurance, in case Blake decided to get creative. My phone rang. Sandra's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. "Alex, my cards aren't working. There must be some mistake with the bank." There was no mistake. By morning, she discovered just how thorough my preparations had been. Sandra called 6 times before 9 a.m. I was having coffee in my downtown restaurant, watching the morning commuters rush past the windows when she finally reached me. "Alex." Her voice was sharp with panic. "My cards are all declined. The bank says there's a problem with our accounts." I said, taking another sip of coffee. "That's strange. Don't play games with me." "What did you do?" "I protected our assets. You should probably ask Blake to cover whatever you need." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to count 3 customers entering the restaurant. "This is childish," Sandra finally said. "No," I replied calmly. "This is strategic. Have a good day." I hung up and headed to the bank. Margaret Davis, Sandra's mother, was waiting for me in the parking lot. At 67, Maggie still carried herself like the Marine drill instructor's wife she'd been for 30 years. Gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, steel blue eyes that missed nothing. "Alexander," she said, falling into step beside me. "We need to talk." "Hello, Maggie. I figured you'd show up eventually. Sandra called me crying about money troubles. Said you'd done something vindictive." I stopped walking. "Your daughter left me for another man, Maggie." "How exactly did you expect me to react?" Maggie studied my face with those sharp eyes. "I expected you to be the man I thought you were when I gave you my blessing to marry her." "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who doesn't let people walk all over him." She paused. Sandra made her choice. Now she has to live with the consequences. That wasn't what I'd expected. "You're not here to defend her. I'm here to tell you that I raised her better than this. But apparently, I failed somewhere along the way." Maggie's voice carried disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "She's made her bed. Let her lie in it." Inside the bank, I completed the final transfers. The joint checking account now held exactly $5,000. Everything else had moved to accounts Sandra couldn't access, managed by trustees she'd never heard of. Bank manager Jennifer Walsh handed me the final paperwork with a professional smile. "Is there anything else you need today, Mr. Brooks?" "Just one thing. If my wife comes in asking about these accounts, you're to refer her to my attorney." "Of course." Back at my office, I found Ashley waiting in the parking lot. My daughter looked older than her 19 years, stress aging her features in a way that made my chest tighten. "Dad," she said, "I know what Mom did." "Ashley, I saw Blake's social media posts. Him and Mom at restaurants, holding hands. It's all over his Instagram." Ashley's voice carried anger that reminded me of her grandmother. "How long has this been going on?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. She's been lying to both of us." I pulled out my phone and showed her Tony Blackwood's business card. "If you want to help me make sure the truth comes out, call this number. Tell him you're my daughter and that you have information about social media evidence." Ashley took the card, her eyes brightening with purpose. "What kind of information?" "The kind that shows Blake Stevens isn't the successful businessman he pretends to be." Ashley proved more resourceful than I'd expected. She spent 3 days documenting Blake's online presence, capturing screenshots of his social media posts, and cross-referencing them with public records. Her generation understood digital footprints in ways mine never could. "Dad, look at this," she said, spreading printouts across my kitchen table. Blake posted these photos from a weekend in Vegas, but according to his business filings, he was supposed to be at a construction conference in Denver. The photos showed Blake at blackjack tables, expensive restaurants, and hotel pools, all time-stamped during a weekend when his company had claimed conference expenses as tax deductions. "That's fraud," I said. "It gets better." I found his ex-wife's social media. She posted about missed child support payments on the same dates he was gambling in Vegas. I studied the evidence Ashley had compiled. Blake Stevens wasn't just a homewrecker. He was a deadbeat father and a tax cheat. But I needed something more immediate, something that would shake him to his core. That evening, I returned to Uncle Frank's building. In the deepest file cabinet, I found what I was looking for: surveillance photographs from 15 years ago. Blake outside a motel with a woman who wasn't his first wife. The photos were dated, time-stamped, and notarized by a private investigator Frank had used. I scanned everything into digital files, then drove to an all-night print shop across town. 2 hours later, I had a complete package: financial irregularities, tax fraud evidence, child support violations, and surveillance photos. Everything bound together with a note that simply read, "Some decisions have consequences." At 3 a.m., I drove to Blake's apartment complex. The building was one of those modern glass towers that looked impressive, but felt hollow. I found his unit number through the directory in the lobby, then took the elevator to the 15th floor. The hallway was empty, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. I placed the package against Blake's door, positioned so he couldn't miss it when he left for work. Walking back to my car, I felt a sense of completion. Blake had declared war in my kitchen, thinking he was dealing with a weak man who would simply accept defeat. He was about to learn that some battles are won before the enemy knows they're fighting. My phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. "We need to talk about this money situation." I deleted the message without responding. By tomorrow morning, she and Blake would have bigger problems than money. The package would be Blake's wake-up call. Everything in his life that he thought was secure was about to become very uncertain. I drove home through empty streets, already planning my next move. Blake had taken something that belonged to me. Now I was going to take everything that belonged to him. Blake's call came at 6:47 a.m. I was having coffee in my kitchen, the same spot where he delivered his ultimatum, when my phone rang. His name on the caller ID made me smile. Alex. His voice was strained, none of the cockiness from 3 days ago. We need to talk. About what? Don't play games. I know this came from you. I took another sip of coffee. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Blake. The package, the photos, all of it. I still don't know what you mean. There was a long pause. I could hear traffic in the background, probably Blake calling from his car after finding my little gift. Look, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Maybe we can work something out. Maybe Sandra and I moved too fast. That's between you and Sandra. Alex, please. Some of that stuff in the package, it could ruin me. Then you should have thought about that before you leaned against my kitchen door frame and told me to deal with it. I hung up and immediately called Harold Richardson. Harold, I need you to purchase a specific property. Today. What property? The building that houses Stevens Development Group. It's owned by Riverside Properties, LLC. Make them an offer they can't refuse. Alex, what are you planning? I'm planning to become Blake Stevens' landlord. 2 hours later, Harold called back. Done. Riverside Properties was more than happy to sell. Apparently, they've been looking to unload that building for months. Perfect. Send Blake Stevens a 30-day notice to vacate. Market rate rent increases are effective immediately. How much of an increase? Triple the current rate. Alex, Harold, everything I'm doing is completely legal. Blake can pay the new rent or find new offices. By noon, Ashley had called with an update. Dad, Blake's been trying to reach Mom all morning. She's not answering his calls. Where is she? Still at Aunt Kelly's. But Kelly called Grandma Maggie, and Maggie called me. Apparently, Mom's been crying all morning. Why? Blake told her about some financial problems he's having. Something about his business being in trouble. I smiled. The package had done exactly what I'd intended. Blake was starting to understand that his problems were just beginning. That afternoon, Blake showed up at my restaurant. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, his expensive suit wrinkled, his confident demeanor replaced by desperation. Alex, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. We need to talk. I'm listening. That building purchase, the rent increase, the package, all of it stops now, or I go to the police. And tell them what? That someone sent you evidence of your own illegal activities. Blake's face went white as the implications hit him. He'd come to threaten me, but now he realized he was the one with everything to lose. What do you want? He asked finally. I leaned back in my seat. I want you to disappear. Take your business, take your problems, and get out of my city. And if I don't, then the next package goes to the IRS, the state attorney general, and your ex-wife's divorce lawyer. Blake sat there for a long moment, the weight of his situation finally sinking in. He thought he was taking my wife. Instead, he'd handed me the keys to destroy his entire life. Sandra returned home on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly reports for my restaurants. She looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes hanging loose like they'd been bought for a different person. The confidence she'd worn like armor 3 weeks ago had been stripped away, leaving behind someone I barely recognized. Alex, she said from the kitchen doorway, we need to talk. I didn't look up from my paperwork. About what? About fixing this mess. Which mess would that be? Your affair with Blake Stevens, or your financial decisions? She stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Blake's gone. He left town yesterday. I heard. You heard? Alex, you orchestrated this whole thing. The building purchase, the rent increase, everything. I finally looked up from my reports. Sandra's eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup carefully applied, but unable to hide the exhaustion underneath. I didn't orchestrate anything, I said calmly. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Those files you sent Blake, the surveillance photos, the financial records, that was you. Blake Stevens made enemies long before he met you. Sandra. I just made sure those enemies knew where to find him. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, uninvited. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we can fix this. Can we? Blake was lying about everything. His business, his finances, his past. I had no idea. You had no idea because you didn't want to know. You were too busy being flattered by his attention to ask the right questions. Sandra's voice hardened. So you're just going to punish me forever? I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself from making the same mistake twice. What mistake? Trusting you. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Sandra's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, hurt, and finally, resignation. Alex, I know I hurt you, but 18 years of marriage has to count for something. It did count. Past tense. What about Ashley? What about our family? Ashley understands that actions have consequences. She also understands that her mother chose to destroy this family for a man who turned out to be a fraud. Sandra stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't just erase 18 years. Watch me. That evening, Ashley called while I was having dinner at my downtown restaurant. Dad, Mom came by my apartment crying. She wants me to convince you to take her back. What did you tell her? I told her that she made her choice when she decided Blake Stevens was more important than her family. Good girl. Dad, I have to ask, are you doing okay? Really okay. I looked around the restaurant I'd built from nothing, watched my employees serving customers with pride and professionalism, felt the satisfaction of something genuinely earned through hard work. I'm better than I've been in months, sweetheart. Harold Richardson called Thursday morning with news I'd been expecting. Blake Stevens filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Stevens Development Group is officially liquidated. What about his personal assets? Gone. The house is in foreclosure, his cars have been repossessed, and he's facing multiple lawsuits from creditors. And Sandra. She's filed preliminary divorce papers. Her attorney wants to negotiate. Tell her attorney that everything goes through you. No direct contact. I hung up and drove to Ashley's apartment near the university. My daughter was waiting with coffee and a laptop full of information she'd compiled about Blake's business collapse. Dad, look at this, she said, showing me news articles from the local business journal. Blake's company defaulted on 6 different construction loans. The bank seized all his active projects. What about his employees? Most of them found jobs with other construction companies. Turns out Blake hadn't been paying into their retirement accounts for months. Any word on where he went? Sarah heard from someone that he's working construction in Arizona. Day labor, minimum wage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Blake Stevens had tried to steal my wife and ended up losing everything he'd built over 15 years. Meanwhile, my restaurants were thriving, my assets were protected, and my family, the parts that mattered, were stronger than ever. Maggie Davis called that afternoon. Alexander, I wanted to thank you. For what, Maggie? For showing Sandra what real strength looks like. She spent years thinking she could manipulate situations without consequences. You taught her otherwise. I didn't do it for educational purposes. Maybe not, but the lesson needed to be learned. She's staying with her sister, Kelly, indefinitely. Probably for the best. That weekend, Ashley and I drove out to the lake house, the one Sandra had never liked because it was too rustic. We spent the day fishing, talking about our plans after graduation, and enjoying the kind of peaceful silence that had been impossible when Sandra was around. Dad, Ashley said as we watched the sunset over the water, I'm proud of how you handled all this. How's that? You didn't get angry. You didn't lose control. You just handled it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being better than the people who wronged you. Is that what this was? Revenge. I thought about that for a long moment, watching the lake reflect the orange and pink sky. No, sweetheart. This was self-preservation. Monday morning brought a call from Sandra's divorce attorney, requesting a settlement conference. I told Harold to schedule it for the following week. What's your bottom line? Harold asked. She gets what she brought to the marriage 18 years ago. Nothing more, nothing less. That's harsh, Alex. That's fair. She chose to gamble with our marriage. She lost. Now she pays the price. 3 weeks later, the divorce was final. Sandra kept her car, her personal belongings, and a small settlement that would cover basic living expenses for about 2 years. Everything else, the restaurants, the house, the investments, remained in trusts that she couldn't touch. I never saw Blake Stevens again, but I heard through business contacts that he'd taken a job with a roofing company in Phoenix, starting over at 43 with nothing but the clothes on his back. Sometimes I wondered if Sandra regretted her choice. Then I remembered the look in her eyes when she'd stood behind Blake in my kitchen, watching for my reaction to his ultimatum. She'd made her choice. Now she could live with it. 1 year after Blake Stevens skulked out of town with his tail between his legs, I opened my 4th restaurant location. The grand opening was everything I'd hoped for. Packed house, local news coverage, and a waiting list for tables that stretched 2 weeks into the future. Ashley was there, helping coordinate with the catering staff between her classes at business school. She decided to study restaurant management, inspired by watching how I'd built something lasting from nothing. "Dad," she said during a quiet moment, "remember when Mom used to complain that you worked too much? I remember a lot of things your mother complained about. She never understood that this wasn't just work for you. This was building something. Some people see the hours. Other people see the empire." Maggie Davis stopped by for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, dressed in her best outfit and carrying herself with the dignity of a woman who'd chosen the right side when the battle lines were drawn. "Alexander," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "your Uncle Frank would be proud." "Think so. He taught you well. Sometimes the best victory is simply outlasting your enemies." The local business journal ran a feature story about my expansion, highlighting how I'd grown from 3 locations to 4 in the span of 18 months. They interviewed several of my long-term employees who spoke about job security, advancement opportunities, and the family atmosphere I'd worked to create. "Brooks understands that taking care of your people is the foundation of any successful business," said Carlos, my first manager, who was now overseeing operations across all 4 locations. The article mentioned my recent divorce only in passing, noting that I'd successfully navigated personal challenges while continuing to grow my business empire. No mention of Sandra by name, no details about the circumstances. Just a brief acknowledgement that life had thrown me a curveball and I'd hit out of the park. That evening, Ashley and I celebrated at the lake house. We grilled steaks, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, and watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Have you heard anything about Mom?" Ashley asked as we sat on the dock with our feet in the water. "Not directly. Harold mentioned that she's working as a bookkeeper for some small accounting firm." "Do you miss her?" I thought about that question, really considered it. Did I miss the woman who'd stood in my kitchen 18 months ago, watching while another man delivered an ultimatum? Or did I miss the memory of who she used to be before ambition and dissatisfaction turned her into someone I didn't recognize? "I miss who she was 20 years ago," I said finally. "But that person disappeared long before Blake Stevens showed up. Do you think you'll ever get married again?" "Maybe. But if I do, it'll be to someone who understands that partnership means building something together, not tearing it down for temporary thrills." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle lap of water against the dock. In the distance, a loon called to its mate, the sound echoing across the lake like a promise. 18 months later, I was standing in the offices of Brooks Restaurant Group, reviewing architectural plans for restaurant number 7. What had started as a survival strategy during my divorce had evolved into something bigger, a regional dining empire that employed over 200 people. Ashley walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee and a satisfied smile. She'd graduated business school the previous spring and was now my director of operations, overseeing everything from staff training to supply chain management. "The Denver location is ahead of schedule," she reported, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Grand opening is set for next month. Any problems with permits or inspections?" "Nothing we can't handle. I learned from the best." Through my office window, I could see the city where I'd built my life, lost my marriage, and found my purpose. It looked different now, not because the buildings had changed, but because my perspective had shifted. I wasn't the same man who'd sat in his kitchen 18 months ago, numbly accepting another man's ultimatum. "Dad," Ashley said, interrupting my thoughts, "I have something to tell you." "Good news or bad news?" "Good news. I'm engaged." I looked at my daughter, 21 years old, confident, capable, with her whole life ahead of her. "To who?" "Michael Torres. He's an engineer, graduated from state last year. You've met him twice. The tall kid with the good handshake and the direct eye contact. That's him." "When's the wedding?" "Next fall. Small ceremony, just family and close friends." I thought about walking Ashley down the aisle, about the kind of man she'd chosen to spend her life with. Michael Torres was nothing like Blake Stevens, Steady where Blake was flashy. Honest where Blake was manipulative. Building where Blake was taking. Does your mother know? I told her yesterday. She cried. Happy tears or sad tears? Both, I think. She's happy for me, but sad that she won't be part of planning the wedding the way she imagined. That was her choice to make. I know, but it still makes me sad sometimes. That evening, I drove past the building where Blake Stevens used to have his offices. It housed a successful architectural firm now, run by people who paid their rent on time and treated their employees with respect. The city was better without Blake Stevens in it. My phone buzzed with a text from Harold Richardson. Final divorce settlement payment completed. All legal obligations fulfilled. I deleted the message and kept driving. Sandra was officially part of my past now, a closed chapter in a story that was still being written. She'd kept her dignity and her basic financial security, but she'd lost everything that really mattered: the family, the stability, the life we'd built together. 6 weeks later, I walked Ashley down the aisle to marry Michael Torres. The ceremony was everything she'd wanted: elegant but not ostentatious, meaningful but not overly sentimental. As I placed her hand in Michael's, I saw in his eyes the same determination I'd had at his age, the same commitment to building something lasting. Later, during the father-daughter dance, Ashley whispered in my ear, "Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." What do you mean? You could have fallen apart when Mom left. Instead, you built something better. Looking around the reception hall at the faces of friends, family, and employees who'd become family, I realized Ashley was right. Blake Stevens had thought he was taking something from me. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to become the man I was always meant to be.